The Yemeni army is already saying that it has targeted the USS Truman. Every time the United States and Israel and the UK conduct these strikes on Yemen, Ansar Allah respond. How are they able to do this? If this goes weeks to months, like Trump is saying, there will be many instances for the first time, because Ansar Allah mainly targeted the Israeli regime because the Israeli regime was conducting an ongoing genocide. This is likely to be an even bigger escalation. How is Ansar Allah still doing this, given that they're supposed to be, as Donald Trump says, met with overwhelming force by the United States?
Well, the United States does not have overwhelming force as it used to have a couple of decades ago. And Ansar Allah's assets, I don't know if how long we got cut off, or if we got cut off or not, but Ansar Allah's assets are all underground. It's not accessible to the United States, and the country is huge. This is not Gaza, and it's not Lebanon. The area is controlled by Ansar Allah. They are the government, and it is mountainous, and they have their assets are deep underground. And obviously, they are getting assistance from Iran. Iran does not hide that, but also the people of Yemen are very sophisticated. They have smart people. They if they're taught how to make missiles, they'll learn how to make missiles. If they tell them, if they're taught how to improve those missiles, they'll improve those missiles, despite the poverty, despite a decade of genocidal war imposed by the West on Ansar Allah and the people of Yemen. They are very sophisticated. They have surface-to-air weapons. They've brought down they have brought down a $500 million worth of American drones. So that's a very sophisticated air defense system. They have surface-to-sea missiles. They have surface-to-surface missiles. They have drones. They have these weapons are made in Yemen. They've been taught how to make them. They've been given the technology, but they're capable of using it despite the circumstances. So the Americans this is going to be very costly for them. Whether the aircraft carriers hit or not, the amount of money that the Americans are going to have to spend to defend those aircraft carriers and naval ships is huge. And remember, they lost what was it, an F-18 that was shot down by one of their own. They claimed was shot down by one of their own missiles a few months back during the later days of Biden. During the clashes that were going on between Ansar Allah, or the Yemeni armed forces, and the U.S. So this is just going to, I think, it's going to be humiliating for Trump. But when it comes to our region, corporate media is with Trump. When it comes to Israel, when it comes to killing Muslims or brown people or Christians from our part of the region, they've shown no sympathy for Christians in our region. They destroyed the Christian population in Iraq. They've destroyed much of the Christian population in Syria. They've allowed the Israelis to basically expel most Christians from Palestine. They have no sympathy for our part of the world, for anyone really. So I'm quite confident that Trump will not be able to succeed in Yemen, and Yemen is going to become just more popular. One of the interesting things about this war, and war is horrible, but and I don't mean the war in Iraq was Saddam Hussein was a monster, but the Americans, they supported him and then they turned against him. So even though the U.S. war wasn't legitimate, but Saddam Hussein was not a good guy. The war in Afghanistan, the war in Libya, the same. It was not legitimate. But this is a war about one side wanting to stop a genocide and the other side insisting to support a genocide. This is, even Ukraine, while I sympathize with the Russians, I don't, the Americans carried out a coup, they lied and expanded NATO. I don't have sympathy for NATO or the United States anywhere on this planet. But in the case of Yemen, or Lebanon for that sake, Hezbollah supporting and sacrificing for Yemen, for Gaza. This is a war about one side opposing genocide and the other side insisting on carrying out or supporting genocide. So it's unbelievable.
As we're talking about Yemen standing up for Gaza and for Palestine, we are also seeing just at every point the Trump administration, the United States as a whole, is having a hard time navigating the terrain of Israel pushing for what it wants, which is, of course, is more expansion. The media is with Trump because all of them want to keep their foothold despite all the rhetoric about withdrawing troops, ending wars. The fact is that the United States wants to keep its foothold in West Asia. It wants to support Israel 150% to do so. At every turn, there are these immense crises that are exploding, and Ansarallah in Yemen is just one of them that it seems like the United States has dove deep into.
I think the region is in a very dangerous situation because a lot of what's happening is driven by internal Israeli politics and Netanyahu's own troubles inside Palestine. And because of that, I think these wars came about. Before the war in Lebanon, I was telling people that I think that there will be war because he has to have war. And then Syria, I think the same. I don't think Syria is going to end well for Israel. I don't think it's going to end well for Turkey or Qatar either. Even though Israel and the Americans and the Israelis definitely want to Balkanize Syria, but I don't think it's. I don't think they'll. I don't think they'll succeed. But Turkey getting a part of Syria and the Israelis getting another part. In the long run, I don't think that's going to work. I don't think anything that he's done over the past year and a half has been good for Israel. They can, just like in Ukraine, they can pretend that they won the war and say, "Oh, Hezbollah has been crushed and Hamas has been crushed and Ansarullah has been crushed. Everyone's been crushed, and Iran has no weapons. Iran is defenseless." They can say that, but it's just like in Russia. They said that for 3 years, and now look at the situation in Ukraine today. So Netanyahu may need war, and if he ultimately decides to do something, then the situation will escalate. If he attacks Iran, it is going to change the situation dramatically. And if the United States attacks Iran, the leader has said that Iran will strike back at the United States, and he said that Iran will hurt the United States more than the United States hurts Iran. And remember, this is not U.S. turf. This is just like in Ukraine. The advantage was with Russia. Why? Because Ukraine borders Russia. The United States, its aid has to go across the ocean, across Europe to get to Ukraine. That's a costly war. The war in Iraq, a lot of it, the expenses were because of the very fact that they had to move everything from the United States to Iraq or other bases to Iraq. The same was true in Afghanistan. In West Asia, the same is true. The United States has to bring in its military. It has to bring in more ammunition. And all of this is going to be very costly, and it's going to be a burden for the United States. And for Iran, it's much more easy to defend itself. It's much more easy for Yemen to defend itself. It's much more easy for the resistance to defend itself because it's their turf. And then in addition to that, the whole Persian Gulf region is full of glass palaces and glass houses. It's full of oil and gas installations and desalination plants and um, tankers and petrochemical plants. If there is war, all of these will just disappear. They won't be able, they will not be able to use them anymore. And that will bring down the global economy. And you know what the situation is right now. Many people in our part of the world don't appreciate what's going on in the United States, what's going on in Canada, what's going on in Europe with regards to the economy. Many people here still think that the Europe and the United States are some utopia where people are living um, the good life and life is very easy. The circumstances are not good for most people in the West. And if this happens, their economies would collapse. And then if the global economy collapses, what do people think is going to happen with immigration? Is it going to decrease or is it going to increase? It will increase tenfold. If you have large numbers of people moving from Latin America to the United States, if the economy collapses, well, it's going to collapse everywhere. And so the places that are worse off, they're still going to be moving towards that land of hope or opportunity, even though it's an illusion. And the same is true in our part of the world. The consequences of war in our region are immense and they are mind boggling. And it's really something that's impossible for me to imagine. So I think the Americans don't want war. I think that it's not a good thing for the Israelis to have war. But Netanyahu wants to remain in power at all costs. And that is what could bring about war.
Oftentimes, when new presidents come into office in the United States, what ends up happening in the foreign policy realm is that we start splitting it all up. That's where the partisanship, the support for Trump versus the support for Democrats, and all of this. What ends up happening is that, okay, you have Russia over here, you have China over here, you have the Middle East over here. Of course, the rest of the world, the US is at war with, and it all gets fragmented and split up. So there can be excuses made for Donald Trump. What I noticed when Donald Trump came into office was that he rushed the ceasefire to save face around Gaza, because that would have been a disaster to inherit as actively as that genocide was going on. He wanted to keep the Lebanon ceasefire going because of for the same reasons. He did not want to inherit that kind of bloodshed, even though, as we've both noted here, that bloodshed continues at perhaps a smaller scale.
And occupation continues.
Yes,
And occupation continues.
exactly. The occupation continues in Lebanon. So, but when he came in after that, there was not a lot of attention on West Asia until he started talking about Iran and targeting Hamas and Ansarallah and Iran and Hezbollah as these kind of terrorist proxies that all needed to be weakened and trimmed down because Biden, right? Biden was the one who allowed all of this to get out of control. But from that rhetoric alone, Professor Marandi, it was quite clear that there was going to be an escalation of some kind. And now we see it with Yemen, but we also see that all of this really speaks to Iran, that the United States does still have this hope that it can weaken Iran. And under the first Trump administration, this was a key point of its agenda, which was to isolate and weaken Iran during that period. So, what do you make of this overall agenda, as well as if you could comment on too, because Russia's come out against what's happening in Yemen, and there are deepening talks between Russia, China, and Iran of basically taking care of their own matters that the United States continues to complain about, whether it's military cooperation or nuclear cooperation. So, what do you make of this overall situation now that the Trump administration is showing its true colors?
This situation that we have today is very different from what we had during the first Trump presidency. The United States is not the United States of that period, and the rest of the world is not the same. Much has changed. China is more immune to US sanctions and tariffs because they've been antagonized over these 8 years. So China is less vulnerable than it was back then, and therefore in a stronger position than it was back then. Russia, we all know how different things are today. It is much less vulnerable because the West has used all of the weapons at its disposal. It no longer has leverage. They can pretend to do sanctions more, just like with Iran. You have the same with Iran. Iran has the sanctions we have maximum pressure sanctions right now. They've never been removed. Biden never removed any sanctions. So Trump's room for maneuver is much more limited. These countries are less vulnerable. The United States and the West are more divided and much weaker because of the economy, because of the endless wars, because of the war in Ukraine, because of the genocide in Gaza. So Trump it doesn't have the sort of, this is not the same world that we're living in today as 7, 8 years ago, or even 4 years ago. So I think it's going to be much more difficult for Trump to behave like he did back then. Even back then, he had no real success. He never undermined Russia, he never undermined Iran, he never undermined China. But I think his ability to hurt is going to be more limited, and the United States is more vulnerable. And there's a lot of talk about an economic crisis in the United States approaching. I'm not an economist, I can't comment, but the situation is not good. And the tariff wars, the United States is in conflict with a host of other entities, unlike back then during the first Trump years. So I think it's going to be much more difficult for Trump to behave like he did before. He wasn't successful back then. He's definitely not going to be successful now. Trump and the United States, the political establishment is united against Iran because of Israel. Otherwise, as I said a bit earlier, this region, if it wasn't for the Israeli regime, this region would have had very good relations with the West. Business and trade would have been normal. You wouldn't have these millions of refugees in Europe. No one wants to leave their homes. So, but because of the Israeli regime, and that's why I always say that the existence of this regime is, morality aside, it just shows the West to be completely immoral, but it is detrimental to Western interests. It is a burden to the West, a big burden. And we're seeing that play out. So I don't believe that Trump has the ability. I think there are probably a lot of people in the military who are telling Trump, don't pick a fight with Iran. But nothing is impossible. And the leader said Iran will strike back very hard and make sure that the Americans are hurt more than the Iranians. And we always have to keep in mind that Netanyahu is a desperate person, and he is willing to do anything to stay in power.